Shalom and welcome to a new podcast from Israel for Fred. 27 European nations have a larger population than Norway, yet this is where you find Europe's largest non-religious pro-Israel membership organization. MIF, in English, With Israel for Peace, was formed in the 1970s and have since grown to more than 11,000 members in Norway. And since 2018, we have expanded our work to Denmark, Iceland and Sweden, where we now boast more than 1,000 members combined. My guest today is Ran Bar Yoshafat, Deputy Director of Kohelet Policy Forum. Kohelet is a Hebrew word for speaker or teacher. Kohelet Policy Forum is a think tank dedicated to secure Israel's future as the nation-state of the Jewish people, to strengthen representative democracy, and to broaden individual liberty and free market principles in Israel. Ran is an experienced speaker, having previously worked for organizations like Israeli Jewish Congress, Jewish Agency and StandWithUs. He has degrees from 3 different Israeli universities. And I invited Ran today to speak about judicial reform in Israel. Kohelet Policy Forum is, according to Times of Israel, the institution that formulated the ideological foundations for the reform. Last week we had the senior journalist Ehud Yaari on the show. He argued that the judicial reform has created the most serious crisis in Israel's history. Ran, however, on the other side, is among the Israeli voices arguing that the reform is saving democracy in Israel. Welcome, Ran.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Thanks for joining. So, are you among those who are destroying the Israeli democracy?
I think that there are 3 issues where I, who's someone who is supporting a legal reform, not necessarily this specific legal reform, but a legal reform, and those who oppose, there are 3 things we disagree on. Number 1 is we disagree on how problematic the situation is right now in Israel and how undemocratic it really is. I'll elaborate on that in a second. The second thing we disagree on is the term gatekeepers. Gatekeepers, which is, I think, more known in corporate law in America. In Israel, it has a different meaning. It means that bureaucrats are the gatekeepers who are protecting the society. And lastly, I think that we just really don't understand what democracy is in Israel. That's the third thing we disagree on, me and those who are against the legal reform. And by the way, I'm not just pro-democracy. I personally am pro a liberal democracy. Liberal democracy, unlike a regular democracy, makes sure that you protect individual freedoms, which is literally what Kohelet is trying to do. And second, it tries to prevent from the current legislator to change the rules of the game altogether. So I'll try to now elaborate on each one of these 3 topics that I said we disagree on.
Yeah, maybe before you go there, maybe explain a little bit to give the historical background for Scandinavian viewers that don't know what happened in 1992 when the basic law, the human dignity and liberty, was introduced, and what the Supreme Court of Israel did in 1995.
So let's try to have a whole comparative constitutional law of Israel in 3 minutes. When Israel was formed, they wanted to have a constitution, but Israel was unable to form a constitution because of the ultra-Orthodox, because of the Arab Party, because of the Labour Party that did not want to restrain itself, many different reasons. So in 1950, there was a decision called the Harari decision, and they said, if we cannot decide on a constitution, let's do it chapter by chapter. The first thing and the easiest thing to agree on is the institutions. So you have the basic law that's called the Knesset, our parliament, the basic law of the government, the basic law of the judges, the basic law of the army, and so on and so forth. And that worked until the mid-90s. In the mid-90s, 2 basic laws were passed who are actually more involved in human rights. One is basic law of freedom of occupation, and the other is basic law, human dignity and freedom. Now, the interesting part is that these basic laws, there's a whole discussion if they were passed in a rightful manner or not. I'm going to put that aside. If we'll have time, I'll go into that. But let's just, for the sake of argument, say that it wasn't problematic how they were passed. These 2 basic laws, they look more like a constitution. Why do I say that? Because they were changed only one time after that, unlike the basic law of the parliament that is basically being changed every parliament. It has a lot of articles, and the concept of it looks like a regular law.
Mm-hmm.
Two important things that happen after the legislation of these two laws. One is the Mizrahi verdict. The Mizrahi verdict is the verdict that every law student in any university in Israel learns about in his first year. There was a dispute between two sides. There was one paragraph that said which side won. And then you had over 300 pages where the court debated in the two following questions. Does Israel have a constitution? And if Israel has a constitution, does that mean that the court has the right to cancel laws? Because if you're saying Israel doesn't have a constitution, so there's no argument, so the court has no power to cancel anything, and we wouldn't have this discussion. The main consensus in Israel, which is not my personal belief, but I go with the flow, is that we have somewhat of a constitution. And if we have somewhat of a constitution, it means that the basic law is in a higher normative level than a regular law. Now, it's interesting because I would argue that this type of decision is something that the people need to decide. Furthermore, the difference between a basic law and a regular law is just that the basic law has the two words basic law before you say the name of the law. So legally, there's no difference, but the court said that's a legal difference. Okay. By the way, I think that the whole concept of the court asking that theoretical question is a problem, because that's not what courts are supposed to do. Courts are supposed to solve disputes and teach people how to behave. They're not supposed to ask theoretical discussions. They're definitely not supposed to say that the country now has a constitution or somewhat of a constitution. So that was the first change, that basically the courts took power to themselves to cancel government decisions and laws. The second thing that took place is the Hilchat Pinchasi. Yitzhak Rabin was the prime minister at the time. He had a corrupt minister, and he was told to fire that minister because of corruption. And Yitzhak Rabin said, I'm not going to. His legal advisor told him, I don't know if I can defend that position in a court of law. They came to a court of law, where the court says the question is not, does the legal advisor has to follow what the prime minister says? The question is the prime minister allowed not to listen to his legal advisor? Now, where do we have the authorities of a legal advisor in Israeli law? The question is, we don't. You cannot find it. So that was the whole story of what happened in Israel. Now, for my first part of where I disagree with those who are opposing the legal reform, they're saying, okay, but the court has only canceled 22. Now it's 23 laws. It's not such a big deal. Now, first of all, I think also canceling 23 laws is a very big deal. But that's not the real issue. The real issue is that people don't know that the court has also canceled dozens of governmental decisions, hundreds of ministerial decisions, and thousands of decisions you have not even heard of. And I'll give you a few examples.
Because of they have stopped it in by the power of the legal advisors, isn't it?
That is another story, that the legal advisor stopped it. That's another issue. I'm saying that the courts said, because stuff are not reasonable or because they don't agree with this policy, not something that's based on a law, which is really problematic in my mind. I'll give you a few examples. When should a holiday take place, or Lag BaOmer? What kind of a haircut can you have in the army? Questions in the bar, in the legal bar association when you're trying to become a lawyer. How many women should be in a certain committee? Should Israel subsidize farm from monkeys? All these weird questions that I'm saying, why is the court making these decisions instead of me? And if you give me a number between 1 to 10,000, I can give you as many as you want examples where the court interfered in a decision that was a legal decision. And just to clarify what we're arguing about, if a minister or if the government is doing something that's not legal, that is against the norms of society, that's against what the law says, not only do I think the court should interfere, I think it must interfere. My argument is that the court and legal advisors often interfere not because something is illegal, but they're interfering because they disagree with the policy, not basing on law. And that is unheard of. That is the definition of tyranny. You have 15 unappointed people, unappointed by the public, or unelected, who basically dictate a policy. I'll give you, if you don't mind, 3 short examples. Netanyahu was prime minister in 1999. He wanted to get rid of the PLO's offices in Jerusalem. The court said that's unreasonable. He said, how come it's unreasonable? They said you have elections in 2 months. That's going to change the political, spectrum of everything in the country. He said, okay. Our previous government, 4 or 5 days before an election, Yair Lapid, who was the prime minister at the time, gave territorial water. People want to say it's not territorial, it's economic. Go for it. Economical water against the basic law in Israel without bringing it to the Israeli plenum, to our parliament, against the advice of the legal advisor, and that was reasonable. So I'm just trying to understand. I, as a citizen, feel like it's not really like there's a list where you can say what is reasonable and what is not. Basically, it's a subjective opinion of the unelected judge, and that's a problem in my mind.
And this goes to the core of what the government passed in law last Monday,
Yes.
or the last week,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, it's really important to emphasize just one thing. People say, well, now we're not going to have any judicial review. That's not the case.
Yeah.
You can have judicial review if a law contradicts a different law. You can have a judicial review if there's a conflict of interest, if the procedure was not according to the right procedure way, if it hurts human rights, if it's hurting equality. So many different reasons, if it's not in the right proportion. So many different tools that you can use for judicial review. What the argument is that the court should not say, "Oh, I find it not reasonable." Based on what? Law? No, I just think it's unreasonable. That's not fair. That's not democratic.
Yeah. So just to give an illustration, maybe you would accept that if I stopped the interview if I said, "Oh, this will interfere with the policies of YouTube," I would not be able to publish this interview. But if I said, "Oh, I didn't like what you said there," maybe it wasn't reasonable. So then I would cancel it because of my own opinion and not by the law that I'm bound by.
Exactly. That's the point. If someone says, Victor, you're violating the law of this platform, I could understand. If someone say, I think I don't like it, it's like, okay, that's not a fair thing. And that's, at the end of the day, that's the issue. I think if you take a veil of ignorance, if I don't know how I'm going to come to the world, a Jew, an Arab, a man, a woman, white, black, what are fair rules of games? And right now, it's not just that I don't think that the rules of the game are fair. I think that there aren't any rules of the game because they change the rules as they go just to get the result that they want. And that's not democratic. I want to give you one more example, if it's okay.
Yeah, sure.
I'll give you my personal belief system. I believe women, if they choose to, should serve wherever they want in the army, in combat units, as fighter pilots. I think that's perfectly fine. I support it. What I'm against is the way that the decision was made and what happened. And I'm saying what was published in Israeli television, so I'm not giving any secrets. There was a former judge called Judge Dorner. She used to be in the army with Judge Shamgar, who was in the Supreme Court. She told him, I'm done with the army. I want to go to the civilian life. He said, no worries. She was a county judge for a short period of time and then became Supreme Court justice. That's red flag number one. Then she told her good friend Eli, meaning Judge Eliyahu Matza, now the tables have turned, she was his commander in the army, red flag number two. She said the following, she said, I'm not sure I'm going to get the result that I want. So let's expand the panel of judges so I'll get the result that I want regarding women's ability to serve as pilots. Now, I'm happy women serve as pilots. I support that from a moral perspective. But that's not how decisions are supposed to be made. Because at the end of the day, if I ask Israelis, all right, we're canceling, there's no legal reform, nothing's going to happen. However, we're going to take a few people like Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, Avi Maoz, people who are considered to be very hawkish, right-winger, and religious in Israel. They're going to be Supreme Court justices, and they're going to decide what's reasonable and what's not. And they're going to decide on what is moral, just, and what's not. Would you accept it? You think most of the people who are now saying that the Supreme Court should have the final word, they'll say, no, God forbid. So I'm saying, so you're not really asking for a proper procedure aspect. You're just saying, I'm getting what I want right now, even though it's undemocratic, and I'm happy with it. And that's not fair in my mind.
Yeah. Do you think that this reasonable clause is the most important part of the reform? Or
not only is the most insignificant part, For the past 8 months, I went to different panels trying to calm things down. Never, not even once. I had over 300 lectures and panels on this topic. Not even once the people who opposed the legal reform brought that as the main issue. And rightfully so. The main issue is how do you appoint the judges?
Yeah.
If the judges were just following the law, then I wouldn't care who's the judge. It doesn't matter who nominates them because they follow the law. That's not the case in Israel. And once you have judges who are also putting their own, everyone has an interest and everyone has their own interpretations. But according to Judge Aaron Barak, who has not been in the system for over 30 years, but his spirit still influenced the way that some of the justices work in Israel, he says the law is 50%. And the interpretation of the judge is another 50%. And I cannot accept it. I understand there's interpretation, but the interpretation should be as narrow as possible. And in my conservative opinion, you need to stick to what is written in the law. So once you're saying I'm going to basically take my interpretation, so you have to have a more diverse group of judges, not the same group of judges who have a certain agenda. And that's, I think, that the main issue that's happening. So that's the number one issue, the committee that nominates judges. The second thing in its importance is the override clause. Can the parliament override a Supreme Court decision? Now, I'll give you my opinion. I don't think that what was proposed in the legal reform was a good proposition. In Israel, we have 120 members of parliament. The original proposition asked for a 61 majority. In my humble opinion, that's not enough. That's the minimal majority. I can give you an example of a solution I would find. I would say, pass it. In Israel, you have to pass a bill 3 times before it becomes a law. Let's say you pass it 3 times, but it's not going to be a law until the next parliament passes it. Like that's like, games with of like making sure it's like close to a referendum. Okay, if again you have a voting for a parliament and again it's able to form a coalition that again is passing the law for the 4th time, that will be my solution, for instance, or not 61, 65. But at the end of the day, and that's my third point where I disagree, I'm jumping to the third point. Let's say 120 members of the parliament, 100 many members of the Knesset, that's all over Knesset, they all say X, and the Supreme Court says Y. Who do you listen to? Some people say, I listen to the Supreme Court. I'm saying, okay, fine, just know you're not democratic. You might be an enlightened tyranny, but you're not democratic. If everyone thinks X and 15 unelected judges say Y, and you're saying you listen to them, that's not the concept of democracy. Now, if we're having a negotiation on the number, I also think 61 is maybe too low of a threshold. 120, that's everyone. You think it should be 65, 70, 80. I'm open for a negotiation. But at the end of the day, in a liberal democracy, the will of the majority wins. It doesn't mean that you're allowed to hurt individual freedoms. It doesn't mean that you're allowed to hurt minorities. But that's not what we're talking about. And by the way, I want to open parenthesis here for 1 second. The right wing in Israel, or the more conservative, traditional people in Israel, are upset about the interference of the Supreme Court mainly in nationalistic issues, rules of immigration, how much force can the IDF use, and things like that. The left, but the progressive, the more secular group in Israel are usually more concerned about individual freedom. And that's funny to me because it's like there's one orange, half of the group wants the peel, the other wants the juice, they're arguing about something. I am a conservative person. I believe in a small government, strong citizen. I always believe in limited power for the government. That's my belief. I believe in individual freedom, in liberty. So it's interesting that people are saying, the court are going to hurt us because the reasonable clause is again the most insignificant. I'm very happy it passed because it's important, but it's most insignificant. The court has so many other, so many tools that they can use to have judicial review.
But it seems like all the arguments that Kohelet and other right-wing groups have put forward, it's not convincing the population, and especially not the centrist party leaders in Israel. But what do you see as a way forward now? With the protests are still going on, and do you think there will be a compromise? Will many of the other reform items be just delayed, or what is your prophecy about the next few months?
There was a lot of questions. Let's take it one at a time. First of all, I was fortunate to work with Yariv Levin when he was the head of the House Committee in the Israeli Parliament. That was 3 years before Kohelet was created, and he said the exact same things when he basically projected to the people his legal reform. So we have a lot of stuff we like to take credit for. I'm very proud of working in Kohelet. We definitely try to raise awareness of the different anomalies that exist in Israel in how we nominate judges, in stuff that should not happen. But we did not write the legal reform. That's not true. We didn't write it. Were we to write it, we would probably write it differently. That's number one. Number two, we are a civil society organization. We are not the policymakers. We can only bring politicians research, I think very good research, and they can decide what they want to do with it. So I think that the fact that people point fingers at us and say, you caused it, like, I'm trying to understand, we do exactly like other think tanks in Israel. Our sin is that we are considered to be more to the right. By the way, more to the right means more in individual freedom and more in democracy as represented officials,
Yeah.
which is democracy. So that's very, very.
So your think tank doesn't take sides in the conflict issues with the Palestinians, for example?
We actually don't deal with the conflict so much. We deal with three things.
Mm-hmm.
One, Israel, or at least not directly. You can think of a way that's like in the shell of what we do. You can find maybe something that works with it, but that's definitely not the core stuff that we do. We work on promoting the fact that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. We work in promoting the sovereignty, which means that when there's tension between elected representatives and bureaucrats, we understand democracy as elected representatives.
Mm.
Second point I did not yet mention. And lastly, we believe in more individual freedom, more free market society, less government regulation. That's what we do. I am myself personally, I'm extremely hawkish. I have my own views. I don't think it represents all of the employees in Kohelet. We have 120 employees. I definitely do not think that my security hawkish perspective represents the average opinion of the people who work in Kohelet. And I'm allowed to be a right-winger. And we also have people here that disagree with me. And that's, I think, the beauty of a think tank that's actually pluralistic and has different point of views. Yeah. But when you're conducting a research, I don't think that my political views regarding Judea and Samaria is relevant to me saying there's too much regulation in the milk and egg industry, or that if I compare in comparative constitutional law, how do you nominate judges in the OECD countries? Israel is different and not in a good way. In fact, I think that the legal reform, it makes Israel more democratic, not less democratic. And I think
and I wanted to show for our viewers here, when you mentioned the international comparison and a graph that I found on one of your websites. I hope you're able to see, and maybe you can explain it in a few words.
Okay, so I don't know if you're saying that this is ours, that's ours. Usually we have different fonts, so maybe this is just a little bit confusing to me, or I see it a little bit differently. But basically the question is, how is Israel different than other countries? So for instance, in America, there's a constitution. I can really understand why a Supreme Court in America would say something is unconstitutional. If Israel does not have a constitution, then it's strange for me that the court has the ability to cancel law. Because again, the court is the one that said that a basic law is above a regular law, while the only difference between a basic law and a regular law is the fact that it says basic law before it. Now the plot thickens. Right now in Israel, the Israeli Supreme Court is saying, can the Israeli Supreme Court cancel a basic law? Mm-hmm. That's like the Supreme Court in America saying the Constitution is unconstitutional. And I'm asking, where is the source of authority that gives the judges the ability to cancel these laws? And people can say, well, but they're doing something right. I'm like, I don't even care if it's right or wrong. That's not a proper procedure. I think it's very, very problematic. That basically what you're saying is you're willing to give 15 people who are not elected by the public the power for everything. In the Federalist Papers, I think it's 78, they say the executive branch has a sword, the legislative branch has a wallet, and the judicial branch has neither. In Israel, it has both. The Israeli judicial branch has a sword and a wallet. That's not good separation of authorities. Another example, how do you appoint the judges? Okay, Israel is, again, an anomaly here. First of all, we have the Bar Association in the committee. De facto, the judges have an automatic veto, and they can decide who's going to be a judge and who's not. And if they would follow the law, then it wouldn't matter so much. But the second that they are interfering in political issues and in moral issues, that's very, very problematic. The fact that the legal advisor for the government is also the attorney general, and he has the final word, even though his rights and duties are not written in the law, that is very problematic in my mind. It doesn't exist anywhere. I think if I would even raise this question in different places, doesn't matter if it's America or Norway, and I would say the minister is doing something according to the law, not against the law, according to the law, but the legal advisor doesn't want it. Do you think the legal advisor has the right to tell him you cannot do it? I don't think we should.
For sure he hasn't.
If he's not following the law, then not only he must. But if he's doing something that is allowed by the law, then what do you mean you're not approving it? Your opinion doesn't matter. You're a bureaucrat, a very high-ranking bureaucrat, doing a good job. I'm not doubting your motivation. And if I can just address the second part, I said 3 points. I said the first, I said the third. I want to address the second, the gatekeepers. The gatekeeper concept, basically they're saying, look, the government, the ministers, the members of parliament, they have an agenda. They have to work for their voting base and so on and so forth. The bureaucrats, the legal advisors, they have no agenda. They're working for the good of the public. And I'm saying, okay, but you didn't ask what I prefer. And what is striking us, the fact that people don't trust the government and don't trust the members of parliament, that is a good thing in my mind. That's how I think democracy should be. You should always be very suspicious of the elected officials because they have power, and you want to change every few years, and you don't want people to have too much power. That's the beauty of democracy. You change the people who are in control every few years with no bloodshed. That I understand. What I cannot understand is people trusting people, the gatekeepers, when they don't even know who that person is. And I gave my lecture, I asked them, do you know what's the name of the Minister of Finance? And they say, yeah, it's Bezalel Smotrich. Do you know what is the name of the Minister of Education? Yeah, it's Yoav Kish. I was like, do you know what is the name of the legal advisor of the Minister of Education? No, but you trust him. I'm like, how do you know that he's following what you want? These are people who went to law school with me at Hebrew U. They're all great people, smart, highly motivated, could have made more money in the private sector. I have no doubt that they're good people. But when they tell me, Ran, we care for you, I'm like, you didn't even ask me what I want. You think that your agenda is on the right side of history, and that gives you the right to ignore what other people want. And even if I sometimes agree with the result, I cannot agree with it because you destroyed the concept of democracy. And I don't always agree with what you decide because often, I'll give you an example. You know, I try to be healthy. I think that drinking different types of sweetened soda drinks are not good. Okay. But I wouldn't want to live in a society where a bureaucrat says, oh, it's not healthy. I am not allowing you to do that. Because someone had a rough day and they want some sugar to feel better, even though sugar is not healthy. There's a question, how much do you think you're allowed to limit my choices just because you think that you're on the right side of history? And I think that's amazing. So these are the 3 points where I and the people who are opposing the judicial reform disagree with. Because that was trying to answer the first part of your question. The second part of your questions, I have a lot of empathy towards the people who are protesting, even when they're cursing me. First of all, in democracy, you're allowed to protest. I don't appreciate the fact that they barge into our offices. I don't appreciate the fact that they put barbed wire and bags of cement and locked our employees in the office. I think that's unheard of in a democracy, and you're not allowed to do this to a civil society organization. But that's a tiny minority. That's not most of the protesters. We have like 500,000 of good people who I disagree with, but they're good people. They're patriotic. We have different opinions. They are worried that democracy is being stolen from them. I have empathy towards them because that's how I felt for the past 15 years when I've been doing research on this topic. I'm like, wait, this is not really democratic if you're not allowing me to have a same vote as you. Basically, they're saying which is kind of funny in Israel, we're the elite, white, doctors, high-tech pilots who are left-wing, and we don't like the traditional religious Sephardi right-wingers. We're going to use all of our economic and army power to change the government's decisions. I'm saying that's tyranny. That's a coup. You're shouting democracy, democracy, but your actions are actually very, very different. Now, I want to give something to their credit. I want to be in my most honest and sincere way to try to present what I think that they're feeling, because I'm not disrespecting their fears. I understand them. They're saying, look, this is a very illiberal government, right? You have a lot of ultra-Orthodox and a lot of religious people, and the Likud party, which is a right-wing party. And you have a prime minister that has a trial against him right now, and you have two ministers who are already convicted of crimes. So that scares them. And then they're saying they're trying to change the legislation in a very fast procedure, and that scares them. Lastly, they're saying they're not just changing a few laws, basically they're changing the rules of the game. And they believe that the changing of the rules of the game is going to make Israel less democratic. Now, I disagree with them on everything, but I'm not disrespecting the fact that that's how they feel, and that is that they fear, and they have an actual fear. So when someone is very scared, it's very hard to have a rational conversation with them. I'm not saying they're not rational. Again, and these are the people who are bashing me and cursing me. I think they're good people. I think that they're pro-Israel people. I think that they care for the country. We disagree. What is mind-blowing to me is that we disagree on a topic that was main consensus for the past 23 years. The previous government had almost the same legislation proposition, the bill propositions as this government. And before that, and before that, and before that. And that is open information. Anyone can go to the Israeli parliament website. They have the archive of all of the law propositions that were there. And you can just, type in, the basic law for legislation, basic law for how you judge, and so on and so forth, and see it. And when I'm saying everyone, I mean Ehud Barak. He is a former prime minister of Israel. He's one of the main forces that's trying to push for the demonstrations. He was supporting these legal reforms. Ehud Olmert, former prime minister, who's now leading the protesters, he was supporting this. Daniel Friedman, former professor Daniel Friedman, former minister of justice, he's a very left-wing guy. He's pushing this forward. Chaim Cohen, former minister of justice. Tzipi Livni, former minister of justice. So many people from right, left, and center said this is what you need to do because it is a right thing. It is a democratic thing. Now, here's where I think that there's a little bit of hypocrisy here. If we have a different government, and unfortunately, I think we are going to have a different government probably soon, because in Israel, we have elections not once every 4 years, but often we have 4 times a year. If we're going to have a different government, the new government will have 2 options. One, they could cancel what this government was doing. If that's the case, so what are you talking about? So there was no problem, no tyranny, no leadership. You're just screaming for no reason. Second thing, and I think is more likely, they'll say, no, we kind of like it. Of course, because it's a better way. You don't want the judge to say, oh, that's unreasonable, and I'm just going to cancel it, even though it's not based on the law. So people are shouting, democracy, democracy, but actually what they're doing is that. Now, for the last part of your question, what will be in the future? I don't know. I try to be optimistic, but to be honest, I think that I cannot remember such a strong tension between different sides of the Israeli society. I've lost many friends, 50, 60 friends that I've known for a long, long time. I think people are so angry on one side and so scared on the other side that it's very, very problematic to come to the table, which is quite amazing, because my friends who disagree with me politically on many issues, if I sit with them, we can reach an agreement on these topics, I think, in like a couple of hours. So I don't really think that the main issue is the legal issue. I think the legal issue is just an excuse to say we actually have a big debate in Israel between, is Israel the nation state of the Jewish people, or is it a country that eats falafel instead of McDonald's and happens to have a lot of Jews there? And I think that is what's happening underneath the surface. That's the main fear of people. And I'm saying this is someone who's very traditional, very proud of my Jewish identity, believes that Israel is the nation instead of the Jewish people. But I'm pro a liberal democracy. And again, I think people sometimes, when we look at the orange, some people are looking at the peel, some people are looking at the juice, and they're not understanding that they're arguing on two different things.
So are you saying that many of the demonstrators, protesters, they are in the streets mostly because they don't like the government more than that they don't like the reform?
1,000%.
Yeah.
1,000%. Most of the protesters are protesting against the government. By the way, the protesters began before the government was actually formed. The day before they formed the government, they were protesting, but it was about like maybe 100, 200 very far left-wing organizations. The protests began to be so empowered and with so many people taking part of it once Minister Yariv Levin presented his legal reform. That's what really took place. Why? Because people were able to, well, the media and some people with bad intentions were able to scare the people by saying, oh no, Israel is going to become a dictatorship. And I'll give you example. They said they're going to pass a law that you will not have elections anymore. Now, it's a very weak argument. You can look at the basic law, the parliament, and you can see that to change something like this, you need more than 80 people. Why would you want to have a situation where we can postpone the elections? Let's say you had a horrible earthquake and elections is supposed to be 3 days from now, and the opposition and the coalition will say, look, right now we have a crisis, let's postpone the election in a month. Okay, that's the case, and you have a very large consensus. Even if the override clause would have passed, 61 is not more than 80, 64 is not more than 80, 75 is not more than 80. That's just a false argument. No one is talking about cancel, which is, by the way, very interesting because the people who were talking about canceling the elections came from the left before the last government. Before the last elections, Benny Gantz from the Machaneh HaMamlechti party and Avigdor Lieberman from Israel Beitenu party, they said, we've had all these elections so many times. Let's pass a law that says no elections for 2 years. But then the prediction of the result of the elections changed, and they saw that the people who are pro Netanyahu are probably going to win. So they said, let's have a different solution. Let's have a minority ruled government. I would expect people to go on the street and say that is not something I'm willing to accept in a parliamentary democracy. So yes, I think there's a lot of hypocrisy. I don't think it's the average Joe. I think the average Israeli is, again, patriotic, cares for Israel, is being scared, he's not happy with the government. And I have to say, I don't think the government is doing a good job in calming people down. I think the government is not doing a good job in that sense. And at the end of the day, the government is the one who's in charge because they're the government. But I think
that brings me to the next question. Wouldn't it be easier for Netanyahu to pass the reform bills if he didn't work with the most right wing
100%
people? Yeah,
100%. Yeah.
But then it's probably the only coalition he was able to make.
Which is also funny. So Yair Lapid, who's the head of the Yesh Atid party, Lieberman, the head of Israel Beitenu party, Benny Gantz, the head of Machaneh HaMamlechti party, Labor, obviously, they all said we will not sit with Netanyahu. Okay, so you literally pushed him. Now, as you know, in a parliamentary democracy, you vote for the parliament. After it, it's for the politicians to decide how they form the coalition. I think this is the first time since Israel was created that you basically voted for a government, not just for the parliament, meaning people voted for one of two blocks, either you don't like Netanyahu or you do like Netanyahu. That's basically what people voted. When they voted, they knew it's either going to be this coalition or that coalition. Now, the difference in the population, it's really a very close split. It's almost 50-50.
Yeah.
It's not an ideological issue, it's a personal issue. And it's interesting. So on one hand, I can understand the people from the left saying it's not fair just because we had a bad strategy and the Meretz party and the Labor Party did not join forces. You have a 64 coalition. It's basically 60-61. And the other side is saying, these are the rules of the game. That's how you won the previous government. The previous government was 6 seats of the parliament against all of the promises that they made before the elections. That's a parliamentary democracy. So yeah, I think that's it's a big issue here in Israel.
So we have to wrap up, but 2 questions in the end. Does Kohelet have any regrets in how they have and how you have conducted your communication and policies for the last year, and how can Kohelet be a constructive partner in making compromises or finding solutions going forward?
From the first day, Kohelet said we call for compromises. From the first day of the legal reform, it's mind-blowing to me because we are a civil society. In the previous government, I'm not going to mention names, but someone came to me and said, is Kohelet a left-wing think tank now? And I was like, why do you say that? They said, you still give research to the government. Like, we are a think tank. We do research and we show our research. We're not policymakers. We can decide, we can recommend on a policy. We do research. I'm not a government elected official. I am a person that sits in a think tank and does research. Would I have conducted a different research? That's a very strange thing to say. No, I want to conduct a serious research. What are people angry at us about? Because we looked at other countries in the world and said, how do they nominate judges? And we showed this to different officials of the government. They said, look, Israel is not nominating judges. We didn't say, this is the way you need to nominate judges. We didn't say, this is what you're supposed to. No, the opposite. We're saying, let's compromise. I'm not anyone that's relevant here, but if it were up to me, I would compromise tremendously because the unity of the people is more important to me than a certain clause in a certain article. But people are angry that we have done research. That's North Korea type of mentality. Basically, that's not okay. You're showing what exists in other countries. You should regret it. You caused the chaos in Israel. No, the people who caused the chaos, you have two sides. You have a government who's not trying to calm people down, and you have people who are protesting, basically shouting for democracy, while actually what they're saying is the exact opposite. And again, these are the same forces, not the same people, because we're talking about 500,000 people. You have different groups. But in these 500,000 who are protesting, you have a small minority that says, close the right-wing TV channels, close the right-wing newsletters, close the right-wing think tanks. And that's not democracy. That's not democratic. So no, I think think tank in a vibrant liberal democracy should do their research. We'll do our research. We're willing to debate with any other think tank that has a different research. That's a pluralistic, vibrant, freedom of expression democracy. That's great. I do think that we need to work on our PR because people have been trying to bash us and have done this very successfully, unfortunately for me. But I hope people will take a second to think and wait, they're doing research. That cannot be a problem to expose how other country nominates judges. If someone thinks that, oh my God, you just showed how they nominate judges in Norway and America, then we have a bigger problem.
Ron, thanks a lot for joining us.
Sure, happy to be here.
All the best.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.